She cleaned hotel rooms at night, smiled politely at guests, and everyone called her Maria the Quiet Housekeeper. For 8 years at the Grand Harbor Resort, nobody knew her real name was Captain Elena Rodriguez. But when the company nurse saw a ghost unit symbol tattooed on her shoulder during a mandatory physical and whispered, "Shadow Wolf," the entire medical office went silent because the woman they'd ignored wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. If stories like this give you chills, subscribe now. This one will haunt you. Most people at the Grand Harbor Resort barely noticed the night cleaning crew. They were invisible workers who appeared after midnight when the guests were asleep, moving through marble lobbies and pristine hallways like ghosts themselves. Maria Santos was just another face in the crowd of women pushing housekeeping carts, emptying trash bins, and ensuring that every surface gleamed before the morning shift arrived. She'd been there 8 years, always punctual, always efficient, always forgettable. The kind of employee managers loved but never really saw. Her supervisor knew she was reliable. The day shift housekeepers knew she left the supply closets perfectly organized. The security guards knew she badged in at exactly 11:47 p.m. every night and badged out at 7:13 a.m. every morning, never varying by more than 3 minutes. But nobody really knew Maria Santos. They didn't know she kept her cleaning cart positioned, so she always had clear sight lines to all exits in whatever section she was working. They didn't know she could identify the make and model of every vehicle in the employee parking lot just by listening to their engines start. They didn't know she'd memorized the patrol patterns of every security guard and could move through the building's blind spots like water flowing around stones. Most importantly, nobody knew that Maria Santos wasn't her real name. The woman who restocked miniature shampoo bottles and folded towels into perfect rectangles had once been Captain Elena Rodriguez, leader of the most classified special operations unit in U.S. military history. While other soldiers fought conventional wars, Elena and her team had operated in the spaces between countries, in conflicts that never made the news, conducting missions that were so secret even their existence was classified above top secret. They called them Shadow Wolves. 12 women handpicked from every branch of the military, trained in psychological warfare, deep cover operations, and elimination techniques that left no trace. They could speak 17 languages between them, blend into any culture, and disappear into civilian populations so completely that even their own intelligence agencies sometimes lost track of them. Elena had been their leader for 6 years. From age 24 to 30, running operations across 4 continents that prevented 3 terrorist attacks, dismantled 2 human trafficking networks, and eliminated targets whose deaths were attributed to accidents, illnesses, or simple bad luck. Her team was so effective, so invisible, that foreign intelligence services weren't even sure they existed. The Shadow Wolves were ghosts, and Elena Rodriguez was their alpha. But that was another life, another identity, another woman. Entirely. The woman who now cleaned toilets and changed bedsheets had buried Captain Elena Rodriguez so deep that sometimes she almost forgot she'd ever existed. Almost. The mandatory physical examination came on a Thursday in November. New insurance requirements meant every employee had to undergo a basic health screening. Most of the staff grumbled about the inconvenience, but Elena saw it as just another part of maintaining her cover. Maria Santos would comply with company policy because Maria Santos was a model employee who never caused trouble. The medical office was a temporary set up in one of the resort's conference rooms, staffed by nurses from a local clinic who'd been contracted to process all 400 employees over 2 weeks. Elena had scheduled her appointment during the day shift change when most people would be too busy to pay attention to who was coming and going from the medical screening. Nurse Patricia Coleman was tired. This was her third 12-hour shift. In 4 days, and she'd seen so many employees that their faces were beginning to blur together. Elena was just another middle-aged Hispanic woman in hotel uniform, polite but quiet, answering health history questions with the minimal responses of someone who just wanted to get back to work. The routine was standard: blood pressure, weight, height, basic vision test, and a quick physical examination. Elena had prepared for this moment for months, planning exactly how to handle every aspect of the screening. She'd researched Nurse Coleman's background, knew her experience level, understood her likely attention to detail. What Elena hadn't counted on was that Patricia Coleman's brother was Army Special Forces. "I'll need you to remove your uniform top for the examination," Nurse Coleman said, turning away to give Elena privacy while she prepared her stethoscope and blood pressure cuff. It was routine, professional, no different from hundreds of other screenings. Elena hesitated for just a fraction of a second. In 8 years of working at the resort, she'd been incredibly careful about when and where she changed clothes. She used private bathrooms, arrived already dressed for work, and always wore high-necked shirts underneath her uniform. The tattoo on her left shoulder was small, barely 2 inches across, but it might as well have been a neon sign to anyone who knew what to look for. She pulled off her uniform shirt and the tank top underneath, keeping her back to the nurse while she folded the clothes with the same precise movement she'd used to fold parachutes and organize gear during her military years. When she turned around, Nurse Coleman was looking directly at her left shoulder. The tattoo was elegant in its simplicity. A stylized wolf's head in profile, rendered in dark gray ink that had faded slightly over the years, but remained clearly defined. Below the wolf, in tiny script that most people would assume was decorative, were the numbers 0715, marking Elena as the 7th member recruited to the 5th Shadow Wolf operation. To anyone else, it would have looked like a standard military tattoo, maybe a unit insignia from a National Guard deployment, or a memorial for a fallen friend. Thousands of veterans had similar ink marking their service, but Patricia Coleman's brother had told her stories during family gatherings after he'd had a few beers. Stories about units that didn't officially exist, about operators who were legends within the special operations community. Stories about an all-female team that had emerged from nowhere 15 years ago, completed missions that no one else could accomplish, and then vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared. Stories about the Shadow Wolves. Patricia had heard the description of their unit insignia, a wolf's head with operational numbers that marked each member's recruitment order and mission sequence. Her brother had sworn they were just rumors, ghost stories that special operators told to impress civilian relatives. Until now, Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her stethoscope. She'd been a nurse for 18 years, had seen thousands of patients, maintained professional composure through medical emergencies and traumatic injuries. But staring at that tattoo, she felt like she was looking at a legend that had stepped out of a campfire story. Elena noticed the change. Immediately, the nurse's breathing pattern had shifted. Her movements became more deliberate, more careful. When their eyes met, Elena saw recognition flickering behind Patricia's professional mask. "Ma'am," Patricia said quietly, her voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there moments before. "That's an interesting tattoo." Elena's training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, evaluate options, maintain cover. The woman examining her was a civilian, but civilians could be compromised, could be intelligence assets, could be dangers in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "Just something I got when I was young," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. "And unremarkable. You know how it is with tattoos. They seemed like a good idea at the time." But Patricia Coleman wasn't buying the dismissive explanation. She'd heard too many of her brother's stories, seen too many photographs of military insignia, understood the difference between random ink and symbols that meant something significant. "Shadow Wolf," she whispered, so quietly that Elena almost missed a dot. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a discharged weapon. Elena's entire body went still in a way that most people would never notice, but that anyone with combat training would recognize as the moment before violence erupts. For 8 years, Elena Rodriguez had been successfully buried. For 8 years, Maria Santos had lived a quiet, unremarkable life, cleaning hotel rooms and staying invisible. For 8 years, no one had looked closely enough to see past the uniform and the accent, and the deliberately forgettable demeanor. Now, in a temporary medical office that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, a tired nurse from a small-town clinic had just spoken, the name of a unit that officially didn't exist. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that both women understood, but neither was ready to acknowledge directly. Elena's mind raced through contingencies, escape routes, and damage control scenarios while maintaining the bland expression of someone who had no idea what the nurse was talking about. Patricia Coleman stared at the tattoo that proved legends were real, that ghosts could be found cleaning toilets in luxury resorts, that sometimes the most dangerous people in the world were hiding in plain sight, that everything was about to change. And both women knew it. Maria Santos had perfected the art of being nobody special. She arrived at the Grand Harbor Resort every night at exactly the same time, parked her 15-year-old Honda Civic in the same spot in the employee lot, and walked through the service entrance with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do than ensure rich people woke up to spotless bathrooms. Her uniform was always clean, but never pressed, crisp enough to suggest she cared too much about appearance. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with whatever elastic band she'd grabbed that morning. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, except for a cheap digital watch that beeped softly every hour. To anyone paying attention, which no one ever was, Maria Santos looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged immigrant woman grateful for steady work that paid enough to cover rent on a studio apartment and groceries from the discount store. The night housekeeping supervisor, Janet Morrison, had managed the cleaning staff for 12 years and prided herself on knowing her people. She knew Carmen had 3 kids and always needed to switch shifts around school events. She knew Rosa sent half her paycheck to family in Guatemala. She knew Teresa was saving money for nursing school and picked up extra shifts whenever possible. But Maria Santos remained an enigma, not because she was mysterious, but because she was so thoroughly unremarkable. She never called in sick, never asked for schedule changes, never participated in the gossip that made night shifts tolerable for most of the crew. She did her assigned rooms efficiently and thoroughly, helped other housekeepers when they fell behind, and disappeared at the end of each shift without saying goodbye to anyone. "She's reliable," Janet would tell anyone who asked about Maria, which happened rarely. "Shows up, does her work, no drama. Best kind of employee, really." What Janet didn't notice was that Maria always volunteered for the rooms on floors 14 through 18, the executive levels where government officials and corporate executives stayed when they visited the resort. She didn't realize that Maria's cleaning cart was positioned differently than everyone else's, always angled to provide optimal sight lines, down hallways and immediate access to service elevators. Janet had no idea that Maria could clean a room in 12 minutes instead of the standard 20, but deliberately worked slower to avoid drawing attention to her efficiency. She never wondered why Maria's cleaning supplies were organized with military precision, or why she always knew exactly how many towels, sheets, and toiletries remained in the supply closets without checking the inventory logs. The other housekeepers on the night crew had their own theories about Maria Santos. Carmen thought she was probably illegal, too afraid of deportation to make friends or cause trouble. Rosa believed she was running from an abusive husband, which explained why she never talked about family or her life before the resort. Teresa assumed Maria was just antisocial, One of those people who preferred cleaning toilets to dealing with human interaction. None of them suspected that Maria could understand their whispered conversations in Spanish, Portuguese, and Tagalog with perfect comprehension, or that she'd deliberately cultivated their assumptions about her background, because assumptions were better than questions. During her breaks, Maria would sit alone in the employee cafeteria, eating sandwiches she'd brought from home and reading paperback romance novels with worn covers and broken spines. The books were props, carefully chosen from thrift stores for their generic appearance. While her eyes moved across pages about brooding billionaires and plucky heroines, her attention was actually focused on the conversations happening around her. She learned which security guards were having marital problems and might be vulnerable to outside influence. She memorized the schedules of maintenance workers who had access to the resort's mechanical systems. She cataloged the personal habits of management staff who handled sensitive information about high-profile guests. Information was ammunition. And Elena Rodriguez had never stopped being a soldier, even when she was pretending to be Maria Santos. The day-shift housekeepers barely knew she existed. Their worlds operated on different schedules, different rhythms. They saw evidence of Maria's work every morning: perfectly made beds, spotless bathrooms, fresh towels folded into decorative shapes that exceeded hotel standards. But they rarely encountered the woman responsible for maintaining their pristine starting point, Lisa Chen, who'd been day shift supervisor for 6 years, sometimes wondered about the night cleaner who left everything so immaculate. The attention to detail suggested someone who took pride in their work, but the execution felt almost mechanical, as if whoever was responsible had optimized every movement for maximum efficiency. "She's like a ghost," Lisa mentioned once to Janet during a shift change meeting. "Everything's always perfect, but I've maybe seen her 5 times in 3 years." Lisa had no way of knowing that Maria had studied her schedule, her habits, her preferred routes through the building. Elena Rodriguez had learned long ago that avoiding contact required understanding patterns better than the people creating them. Lisa never saw Maria because Maria made sure Lisa never had a reason to look for her. The resort guests existed, Maria's world, as obstacles to navigate rather than people to serve. She cleaned their rooms while they slept, removed evidence of their indulgences, and maintained their luxury without ever interacting directly with the people who could afford $800 per night accommodations. But Elena Rodriguez studied them with the intensity of someone whose life had once depended on reading people correctly. She learned to identify foreign intelligence operatives by the way they arranged their belongings, too neat and deliberate for actual tourists. She recognized politicians by how they positioned their phones and documents, always within reach but never completely secure. She cataloged corporate executives by their prescription medications and the contents of their briefcases, left carelessly open because they assumed hotel staff were invisible and irrelevant. Sometimes she found things that made her hands clench. Around her cleaning supplies, photographs that shouldn't exist, documents discussing arms deals, phones receiving encrypted messages in languages that suggested connections to groups she'd once hunted. But Elena Rodriguez was dead, and Maria Santos was just a housekeeper who couldn't read English well enough to understand what she was cleaning around. The resort's security director, Mike Patterson, ran background checks on all employees as part of standard procedure. Maria Santos's file showed exactly what it was supposed to show. A woman who'd immigrated from Mexico 15 years ago, worked various housekeeping jobs, had no criminal record, and no connections to anyone of interest. To law enforcement or intelligence agencies, Patterson never dug deeper because there was no reason to dig deeper. Maria Santos paid taxes, never caused problems, and had references from previous employers who remembered her as quiet and reliable. Her social security number checked out. Her address corresponded to a modest apartment building in a working class neighborhood. Everything about her background suggested a person trying to build a simple, Honest life in America. The forged identity had cost Elena Rodriguez everything she'd saved during her military career, plus money she'd earned through private security contracts during her first months in hiding. But it had been worth every penny to become someone so thoroughly ordinary that no one would ever think to look deeper. 8 years of perfecting invisibility. 8 years of being Maria Santos so completely that sometimes Elena Rodriguez felt like a half-remembered dream. 8 years of watching, waiting, and wondering if the people who destroyed her unit would eventually find her despite her careful camouflage. She'd built a life that was safe, predictable, and utterly forgettable. She cleaned rooms that cost more per night than most people earned in a week, invisible to guests who barely registered her existence and co-workers, who knew nothing about her beyond her punctuality and work ethic. It was a perfect cover, maintained through discipline that would have impressed her former commanding officers, and attention to detail that had kept her alive, through missions that officially never happened, until Nurse Patricia Coleman recognized a tattoo that was supposed to be meaningless ink on the shoulder of a woman who was supposed to be nobody at all. Patricia Coleman's hands had stopped shaking, but her pulse was still racing as she tried to process what she was looking at. The wolf tattoo wasn't just similar to the insignia her brother had described during those late-night conversations at family gatherings. It was identical, down to the specific angle of the wolf's head and the precise font used for the operational numbers beneath it. Staff Sergeant David Coleman had served 3 tours with Army Special Forces before a roadside bomb in Afghanistan sent him home with a Purple Heart and stories he wasn't supposed to tell. During Christmas dinners and 4th of July barbecues, after their parents had gone to bed and the beer had loosened his tongue, David would share fragments of the legends that circulated through special operations communities like ghost stories. Around a campfire, the Shadow Wolves were the most persistent legend of all. A unit that supposedly consisted entirely of women, recruited from different branches of the military and trained for missions that conventional special forces couldn't accomplish. David had heard whispers about them from Rangers who'd served in Iraq, from Navy SEALs who'd operated in Afghanistan, from Marine Force Recon who'd worked assignments in Africa and Southeast Asia. The stories were always secondhand. Someone who knew someone who'd worked with them once. An insertion gone wrong where a female operative had materialized out of nowhere to extract a compromised team. A high-value target elimination in Syria where security cameras showed a woman entering a building, but the target's death was attributed to a heart attack with no signs of foul play. A hostage rescue in Somalia where local witnesses described ghostly female figures who'd appeared at dawn and vanished before anyone could get a clear look at their faces. David had shown Patricia photographs on his phone, blurry images shared through encrypted military channels that supposedly showed Shadow Wolf operational insignia recovered from safe houses and abandoned equipment. The wolf head tattoo was always the same, a profile view facing left, with numbers below indicating recruitment order and operational sequence. Patricia had assumed the stories were mythology, the kind of legends that grew around classified operations, until truth became indistinguishable from fiction. Special operations communities were notorious for creating elaborate backstories around units that might or might not exist, building reputations that served psychological warfare purposes as much as actual tactical ones. But the woman sitting half-naked on the examination table in front of her had that exact tattoo inked into her left shoulder with the precision of someone who'd earned the right to wear it. Elena recognized the shift in Patricia's demeanor immediately. The nurse's breathing had changed from professional routine to controlled alarm. Her movements became more deliberate, more careful, the way medical personnel moved around patients they suspected might be dangerous. When Patricia reached for her blood pressure cuff, Elena noticed the slight tremor in her hands that suggested adrenaline response. Elena's mind automatically cycled through threat assessment protocols that had been drilled into her during months of training at facilities. that didn't appear on any military maps. Patricia Coleman wasn't military, but her brother was special forces. She'd recognized the tattoo, which meant she had access to information that should have been compartmentalized above her clearance level. Compromise. Scenarios flashed through Elena's consciousness like frames in a damaged film reel. If Patricia reported the tattoo to authorities, Elena had perhaps 6 hours before federal agents would arrive to investigate. If Patricia mentioned it to her brother, military intelligence networks would activate within hours. If Patricia was already an asset for foreign intelligence services, Elena might have minutes before extraction teams arrived. Elena forced her body language to remain relaxed, maintaining the posture of someone who had no idea why the nurse was acting strangely. Maria Santos would be confused by this behavior, maybe concerned about the quality of her medical examination, but certainly not calculating escape routes and elimination options. "Is everything all right?" Elena asked, injecting just the right amount of worried confusion into her voice. "You seem different all of a sudden." Patricia was struggling with her own recognition protocols. Her nursing training emphasized patient confidentiality and professional boundaries, but her brother's stories had always ended with warnings about operational security and the dangers of asking too many questions about things that were classified. For good reasons, she completed the blood pressure measurement in silence, trying to organize her thoughts while maintaining professional composure. Elena's reading was perfectly normal, which seemed impossible given the tension crackling between them like static electricity before a thunderstorm. "Your tattoo," Patricia said finally, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "It's very distinctive. Does it have special meaning for you?" Elena met Patricia's eyes directly, searching for additional signs of recognition or deception. The nurse was nervous but didn't display the calculated awareness of someone who'd been expecting this encounter. Her knowledge appeared to be accidental, derived from family connections rather than professional intelligence gathering. "It's from when I was younger," Elena replied, using the same dismissive tone she'd employed earlier. "I was in the military. Briefly, just something to remember that time in my life." Patricia nodded, but Elena could see her mentally comparing the tattoo to whatever descriptions her brother had provided. The nurse was intelligent enough to understand the implications of what she'd discovered, but uncertain about how to process information that challenged everything she'd assumed about military legends and hotel housekeepers. "Which branch?" Patricia asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than investigatively curious. Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating the risks of providing additional information versus the risks of appearing evasive. "Army," she said finally, choosing the branch most likely to satisfy Patricia's curiosity without raising additional questions. Patricia completed the rest of the examination in professional silence, but Elena could feel her attention like a weight pressing against her carefully constructed identity. Every movement, every response to routine medical tests was being analyzed through the lens of Patricia's newfound suspicions about her patient's background. When the examination concluded, Elena dressed methodically while Patricia documented the results on standard medical forms. The routine paperwork provided both women with something to focus on besides the enormous question mark that now hung between them like fog. "Everything looks normal," Patricia said, signing the completion form with hands that had finally stopped. Trembling, "You can return to work whenever you're ready." Elena took the medical clearance paperwork and stood to leave, but Patricia's voice stopped her at the door. "Ma'am," Patricia said, her tone carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the examination. "Thank you for your service." The words landed like a precision strike against Elena's carefully maintained emotional barriers. She hadn't heard those words in 8 years, hadn't been acknowledged as anything more than invisible labor since the day she'd been forced to bury Captain Elena Rodriguez and become Maria Santos. For just a moment, Elena's mask slipped enough for Patricia to see something dangerous flickering behind her patient's eyes. Not gratitude for recognition, but the cold assessment of someone calculating whether witness elimination was necessary for operational security. Elena nodded once and left the medical office without another word, leaving Patricia alone with the knowledge that legends sometimes cleaned hotel rooms and ghosts occasionally submitted to routine medical examinations. Patricia sat motionless for several minutes after Elena departed, staring at the medical form that identified her patient as Maria Santos, a 42-year-old housekeeper with no significant medical history and no reason to attract additional attention from anyone. She thought about her brother's warnings regarding operational security and the importance of keeping classified information compartmentalized. She thought about patient confidentiality and her professional obligations as a healthcare provider. She thought about the implications of discovering that someone who wasn't supposed to exist was working night shifts at a luxury resort 50 miles from a major military installation. Most of all, she thought about the look in Elena's eyes during those final seconds before she'd left the examination room. The look of someone who was perfectly capable of ensuring that inconvenient witnesses never had opportunities to share inconvenient discoveries. Patricia Coleman picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found her brother's number. Her finger hovered over the call button while she tried to decide whether discovering a shadow wolf was worth risking the consequences of proving that legends were real. In her hotel uniform, walking through corridors she'd cleaned for 8 years, Elena Rodriguez was already planning contingencies for a cover identity that might have just been completely compromised by a tired nurse who'd heard too many bedtime stories about units that officially didn't exist. Patricia Coleman stared at her phone for 23 minutes after Elena left the medical office, her brother's contact information glowing on the screen like an accusation. Every few minutes she would start to dial, then stop, caught between professional ethics and the growing certainty that she'd stumbled onto something that extended far beyond routine employee health screenings. The smart thing would be to forget what she'd seen, file the paperwork, and move on to the next patient. Maria Santos had passed her medical examination with no significant findings. Her blood pressure was normal, her reflexes were excellent for someone her age, and there were no health issues that would prevent her from continuing her employment at the resort. From a medical perspective, the case was closed, but Patricia couldn't stop thinking about the precision of that tattoo, the way it matched her brother's descriptions, down to details that wouldn't have been included in casual military stories. She couldn't forget the momentary transformation she'd witnessed when Elena's carefully maintained mask had slipped, revealing something calculating and dangerous underneath the humble demeanor of a hotel housekeeper. At 3:17 a.m., Patricia finally made the call. David Coleman answered on the second ring despite the early hour, instantly alert in the way that military training never fully leaves someone's system. "Patricia, what's wrong?" "David, I need to ask you about those stories you used to tell, the Shadow Wolf unit. You said they were probably just legends, but you showed me pictures of their insignia." Silence stretched across the phone connection, while David processed his sister's question and tried to understand why she was asking about classified legends at 3 in the morning. "Why are you asking me this, Pat?" Patricia took a deep breath and committed to crossing a line she couldn't uncross. "Because I think I just examined one of them during a medical screening at work." David's response came after a pause that felt like hours. "Patricia, listen to me very carefully. Where are you right now? Are you alone?" The urgency in her brother's voice sent ice through Patricia's veins. "I'm at home." "David, what aren't you telling me about these people?" "The Shadow Wolves weren't legends, Pat. They were real. And they were eliminated 15 years ago because they discovered something that certain people needed to stay buried. If one of them is still alive and you've made contact, you're in more danger than you can possibly understand." Patricia felt the walls of her apartment closing in around her as David continued speaking in the clipped, professional tone he used. when discussing life and death situations. I need you to pack a bag right now and drive to Mom and Dad's house. Don't tell anyone where you're going, don't use your credit cards, and don't go back to work until I can figure out what's happening. David, you're scaring me. Good, you should be scared. The people who eliminated Shadow Wolf have resources and reach that extend into civilian infrastructure. If they think you've compromised one of their cleanups, they'll respond with permanent solutions. While Patricia listened to her brother explain why her life had just become complicated, Elena Rodriguez was conducting her own damage assessment from the employee parking lot of the Grand Harbor Resort. She sat in her Honda Civic with the engine off, running through scenarios and calculating probabilities with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through operations across 4 continents. Patricia Coleman knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to understand the full implications of what she'd discovered. Her brother's Special Forces background meant information would travel through military intelligence networks, but those same networks might provide Elena with advance warning if federal agencies decided to investigate. Elena's biggest concern wasn't Patricia herself, but the institutional response that would follow if the nurse reported her suspicions to authorities. The Shadow Wolf elimination had been thorough and brutal specifically because the unit had discovered evidence of high-level corruption within the intelligence community. If Elena's survival became known, it would reopen investigations that powerful people had spent enormous resources to close permanently. She had perhaps 6 hours before Patricia's phone call to her brother triggered responses from agencies that specialized in making inconvenient problems disappear. Elena could run, abandon 8 years of careful identity construction, and disappear into another manufactured life somewhere else in the country. She had contingency plans, emergency funds, and false documentation ready for exactly this scenario. Running would mean abandoning the surveillance operation she'd been conducting from her position at the resort, the careful intelligence gathering that had taken years to establish. Elena hadn't spent 8 years cleaning luxury hotel rooms just to hide from her past. She'd been hunting the people responsible for destroying her unit, using her invisible position to monitor the high-level government officials and defense contractors who frequented the Grand Harbor Resort. At 4:42 a.m., David Coleman made the first in a series of phone calls that would escalate through military intelligence networks like wildfire climbing a dry hillside. His contact was Master Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a friend from his deployment days who now worked in Army intelligence and had access to databases that could verify or debunk his sister's claims. Jen, I need a favor, and it's going to sound crazy. David, it's almost 5 in the morning. This better be important. My sister thinks she encountered a Shadow Wolf operative working as a housekeeper at some resort in Virginia. I know how that sounds, but she described their unit tattoo in perfect detail, including elements that weren't in any of the legends that circulated through our community. Jennifer Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Shadow Wolf was a file designation that appeared in intelligence databases with classification levels that exceeded her clearance, but she'd heard enough whispered conversations among senior analysts to know the unit had been real and their elimination had been controversial within certain circles. David, that unit was declared KIA 15 years ago. Complete team elimination during a classified operation that went sideways in Afghanistan. What if the elimination wasn't as complete as the paperwork suggested? Jennifer understood the implications immediately. If Shadow Wolf survivors existed, it meant the official reports about their deaths had been falsified, which suggested the elimination had been intentional rather than operational casualties. False death reports were tools used to disappear people who knew things that threatened national security interests. I'll make some calls, Jennifer said carefully. But David, if your sister is right about this, she stumbled into something that got a lot of good soldiers killed. Tell her to stay invisible until we know more. By sunrise, Jennifer's inquiries had reached the attention of Colonel Marcus Davidson at the Pentagon, a military intelligence officer who'd been involved in the Shadow Wolf investigation 15 years earlier. Davidson remembered the case clearly because it had been one of the few times he'd been ordered to stop investigating and classify all related materials above his security clearance level. Davidson pulled the Shadow Wolf files from secured archives and spent an hour reviewing documents he hadn't seen since the case was closed. The official reports indicated complete team elimination during a mission in the Tora Bora region. But Davidson had always suspected the truth was more complicated than the paperwork suggested. At 9:15 a.m., Davidson made a phone call to a civilian number that connected him to Marcus Kellerman, now retired from government service but still consulted on matters involving special operations security. Kellerman had been one of the officials who'd overseen the Shadow Wolf case closure, and Davidson wanted to inform him that questions were being raised about survivors. "Marcus, we have a situation. Someone's asking questions about Shadow Wolf, claiming to have made contact with a surviving operative." Kellerman's response carried the weight of someone who'd spent years ensuring that certain secrets stayed buried. "That's impossible, Marcus. Shadow Wolf was completely eliminated. I have personal confirmation from field operatives who verified the kills. What if your field operatives were wrong? What if someone survived and has been living under deep cover for 15 years? The silence that followed Davidson's question lasted long enough to confirm what he'd always suspected. The Shadow Wolf elimination hadn't been a military casualty. It had been an assassination designed to silence people who discovered something that threatened individuals with the power to rewrite official reports and make inconvenient soldiers disappear. "I'll handle this personally," Kellerman said finally. "Give me everything you have on this alleged contact." As Davidson compiled information to send to Kellerman, he didn't notice the slight smile in the retired official's voice or the fact that Kellerman's first phone call after ending their conversation was to a private security firm that specialized in problems requiring permanent solutions. Elena Rodriguez had spent 8 years waiting for this moment, when her carefully maintained invisibility would finally be compromised, and the people who destroyed her unit would learn that their cleanup hadn't been as thorough as they'd believed. The hunt was about to begin again. But this time Elena intended to be the predator rather than the prey. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been recruited for Shadow Wolf when she was 22 years old, pulled from Army intelligence after completing a psychological warfare assignment in Eastern Europe that had resulted in the peaceful defection of 3 high-level Russian operatives without firing a single shot. The recruitment process itself was classified above top secret, conducted by a selection committee that didn't officially exist, and funded through budget lines that were buried so deeply in defense spending that even congressional oversight committees couldn't trace them. The woman who approached Elena in a coffee shop outside Fort Bragg introduced herself only as Agent 7 and offered Elena an opportunity to serve her country in ways that conventional military service couldn't provide. The conversation lasted exactly 11 minutes, during which Agent 7 outlined a program that would require Elena to disappear from her current life, sever all personal relationships, and commit to operations that would never be acknowledged by any government agency. Elena had been given 72 hours to decide whether she was willing to become a ghost in service to national security, interests that extended far beyond traditional warfare. She'd said yes without hesitation. The Shadow Wolf training facility was located in Montana, disguised as a private hunting lodge that wealthy executives used for corporate retreats. Elena arrived there on a February morning with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single duffel bag containing personal items she'd been told to bring for psychological comfort during the 18-month training program that would transform her into something that didn't exist in any military manual. The 11 other women selected for Shadow Wolf came from different branches of the military, each chosen for specific skill sets that would complement the unit's operational requirements. Sarah Chun had been a Navy cryptologist who could break encryption codes that stumped NSA supercomputers. Maria Vasquez was a Marine sniper who'd never missed a target beyond 800 meters. Rachel Morrison had been an Air Force pilot who could fly anything with wings and several things that shouldn't technically be able to achieve sustained flight. Elena's specialty was psychological manipulation and cultural infiltration. She could adopt the speech patterns, mannerisms, and behavioral characteristics of different social classes, ethnicities, and nationalities with such precision that native speakers would accept her as one of their own. More importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed her to identify individual vulnerabilities and exploit them for intelligence gathering or behavioral modification purposes. The training program was designed to push each woman beyond the limits of conventional special operations preparation. They learned to kill in 17 different ways that would be attributed to natural causes or accidents. They mastered languages not just for communication, but for psychological warfare, understanding how to use linguistic patterns to create trust, fear, confusion, or compliance in target populations. Elena excelled at infiltration scenarios where she would be inserted into hostile environments with manufactured identities and tasked with gathering intelligence, eliminating targets, or manipulating political situations without leaving evidence of foreign intervention. During a training exercise in Morocco, she spent 6 months working as a translator for a terrorist cell while feeding information to CIA operatives and gradually turning cell members against each other until the organization collapsed from internal conflicts that appeared to be based on personal grievances rather than external sabotage. After completing training, Elena was designated Shadow Wolf 7, the tactical leader responsible for mission planning and field command during operations. Her first assignment took her to Serbia, where ethnic tensions were threatening to destabilize the region in ways that could have drawn NATO forces into another Balkan conflict. Elena spent 8 months working as a refugee aid coordinator while secretly orchestrating the elimination of extremist leaders on both sides of the ethnic divide. The Serbian operation established Elena's reputation within Shadow Wolf as someone who could navigate complex political situations and achieve strategic objectives through methods that were elegant in their subtlety. Local authorities attributed the deaths of 12 ethnic nationalist leaders to gang violence, personal vendettas, and unfortunate accidents. International peacekeeping forces credited improved regional stability to successful diplomatic negotiations and economic development programs. Elena's second major operation took her to Myanmar, where military commanders were planning a genocide against ethnic minorities that would have resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. She infiltrated the military command structure by seducing a colonel who had access to operational planning documents, then systematically eliminated the operation's key organizers over a 4-month period, while making their deaths appear to be the result of a power struggle within the military hierarchy. The Myanmar mission, Elena promotion to Shadow Wolf Alpha, making her the unit's primary field commander and strategic planner. She was 26 years old and had already prevented 2 potential humanitarian disasters without leaving any evidence of American involvement. Her reputation within the intelligence community was built on operations that never officially happened, but whose effects rippled through international relations in ways that served American interests. Elena could destabilize governments, eliminate threats, or strengthen strategic alliances, using methods that were so subtle they appeared to be natural developments in regional politics rather than carefully orchestrated intelligence operations. Shadow Wolf Unit, under Elena's leadership, conducted 47 operations across 6 continents over 5 years, preventing terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of civilians, eliminating weapons trafficking networks that were supplying hostile regimes, and disrupting financial systems that funded anti-American activities throughout the developing world. Elena's team specialized in problems that conventional special operations couldn't solve because they required long-term infiltration, cultural expertise, and elimination methods that left no trace of foreign involvement. They could spend months establishing cover identities, building relationships with target populations, and positioning themselves to achieve strategic objectives through apparent coincidences rather than obvious interventions. The unit's most successful operation took place in Afghanistan, where Elena spent 14 months working as a medical aid worker while gathering intelligence on Taliban financial networks and opium trafficking operations. Her team systematically eliminated key figures in the drug trade while documenting evidence of corruption within Afghan government officials who were supposed to be American allies. Elena discovered that several high-ranking officials in the Afghan Ministry of Defense were not only facilitating Taliban operations, but were actively selling American military intelligence to insurgent commanders. The evidence she gathered implicated 3 American defense contractors who were using their positions to manipulate military procurement contracts and intelligence sharing agreements for personal profit. The corruption network Elena uncovered extended from Afghan poppy fields to Pentagon procurement offices, involving American military officers, defense contractors, and civilian officials who were trading soldiers' lives for Swiss bank account deposits. The evidence she compiled was comprehensive enough to trigger investigations that would have reached the highest levels of the Defense Department and resulted in congressional hearings that could have destabilized American military operations throughout the region. Elena transmitted her findings to her commanding officers through encrypted channels, expecting the evidence to trigger arrests and prosecutions that would clean up a corruption network that was directly responsible for American combat deaths. Instead, she received orders to cease her investigation and prepare for immediate extraction from Afghanistan. When Elena questioned the orders, she was told that her intelligence had been reviewed by senior officials who determined that the corruption allegations were based on insufficient evidence and could compromise ongoing operations if pursued further. Elena realized that the corruption network she'd discovered included people with enough power to silence investigations and eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Her unit had stumbled onto something that threatened individuals who could rewrite official reports, classify evidence above congressional oversight levels, and make problems disappear using resources that operated outside normal military command structures. That's when Elena Rodriguez learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones wearing the same uniform, and sometimes serving your country means discovering that your country's leadership has been compromised by people who consider patriotism a commodity to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been recruited for Shadow Wolf when she was 22 years old, pulled from Army intelligence after completing a psychological warfare assignment in Eastern Europe that had resulted in the peaceful defection of 3 high-level Russian operatives without firing a single shot. The recruitment process itself was classified above top secret, conducted by a selection committee that didn't officially exist, and funded through budget lines that were buried so deeply in defense spending that even congressional oversight committees couldn't trace them. The woman who approached Elena in a coffee shop outside Fort Bragg introduced herself only as Agent 7 and offered Elena an opportunity to serve her country in ways that conventional military service couldn't provide. The conversation lasted exactly 11 minutes, during which Agent 7 outlined a program that would require Elena to disappear from her current life, sever all personal relationships, and commit to operations that would never be acknowledged by any government agency. Elena had been given 72 hours to decide whether she was willing to become a ghost in service to national security interests that extended far beyond traditional warfare. She'd said yes without hesitation. The Shadow Wolf training facility was located in Montana, disguised as a private hunting lodge that wealthy executives used for corporate retreats. Elena arrived there on a February morning with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single duffel bag containing personal items she'd been told to bring for psychological comfort during the 18-month training program that would transform her into something that didn't exist in any military manual. The 11 other women selected for Shadow Wolf came from different branches of the military, each chosen for specific skill sets that would complement the unit's operational requirements. Sarah Chun had been a Navy cryptologist who could break encryption codes that stumped NSA supercomputers. Maria Vasquez was a Marine sniper who'd never missed a target beyond 800 meters. Rachel Morrison had been an Air Force pilot who could fly anything with wings and several things that shouldn't technically be able to achieve sustained flight. Elena's specialty was psychological manipulation and cultural infiltration. She could adopt the speech patterns, mannerisms, and behavioral characteristics of different social classes, ethnicities, and nationalities with such precision that native speakers would accept her as one of their own. More importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed her to identify individual vulnerabilities and exploit them for intelligence gathering or behavioral modification purposes. The training program was designed to push each woman beyond the limits of conventional special operations preparation. They learned to kill in 17 different ways that would be attributed to natural causes or accidents. They mastered languages not just for communication, but for psychological warfare, understanding how to use linguistic patterns to create trust, fear, confusion, or compliance in target populations. Elena excelled at infiltration scenarios where she would be inserted into hostile environments with manufactured identities and tasked with gathering intelligence, eliminating targets, or manipulating political situations without leaving evidence of foreign intervention. During a training exercise in Morocco, she spent 6 months working as a translator for a terrorist cell while feeding information to CIA operatives and gradually turning cell members against each other until the organization collapsed from internal conflicts that appeared to be based on personal grievances rather than external sabotage. After completing training, Elena was designated Shadow Wolf 7, the tactical leader responsible for mission planning and field command during operations. Her first assignment took her to Serbia, where ethnic tensions were threatening to destabilize the region in ways that could have drawn NATO forces into another Balkan conflict. Elena spent 8 months working as a refugee aid coordinator while secretly orchestrating the elimination of extremist leaders on both sides of the ethnic divide. The Serbian operation established Elena's reputation within Shadow Wolf as someone who could navigate complex political situations and achieve strategic objectives through methods that were elegant in their subtlety. Local authorities attributed the deaths of 12 ethnic nationalist leaders to gang violence, personal vendettas, and unfortunate accidents. International peacekeeping forces credited improved regional stability to successful diplomatic negotiations and economic development programs. Elena's second major operation took her to Myanmar, where military commanders were planning a genocide against ethnic minorities that would have resulted in hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. She infiltrated the military command structure by seducing the colonel who had access to operational planning documents, then systematically eliminated the operation's key organizers over a 4-month period while making their deaths appear to be the result of a power struggle within the military hierarchy. The Myanmar mission earned Elena promotion to Shadow Wolf Alpha, making her the unit's primary field commander and strategic planner. She was 26 years old and had already prevented 2 potential humanitarian disasters without leaving any evidence of American involvement. Her reputation within the intelligence community was built on operations that never officially happened, but whose effects rippled through international relations in ways that served American interests. Elena could destabilize governments, eliminate threats, or strengthen strategic alliances, using methods that were so subtle they appeared to be natural developments in regional politics rather than carefully orchestrated intelligence operations. Shadow Wolf Unit, under Elena's leadership, conducted 47 operations across 6 continents over 5 years, preventing terrorist attacks that would have killed thousands of civilians, eliminating weapons trafficking networks that were supplying hostile regimes, and disrupting financial systems that funded anti-American activities throughout the developing world. Elena's team specialized in problems that conventional special operations couldn't solve because they required long-term infiltration, cultural expertise, and elimination methods that left no trace of foreign involvement. They could spend months establishing cover identities, building relationships with target populations, and positioning themselves to achieve strategic objectives through apparent coincidences rather than obvious interventions. The unit's most successful operation took place in Afghanistan, where Elena spent 14 months working as a medical aid worker while gathering intelligence on Taliban financial networks and opium trafficking operations. Her team systematically eliminated key figures in the drug trade while documenting evidence of corruption within Afghan government officials who were supposed to be American allies. Elena discovered that several high-ranking officials in the Afghan Ministry of Defense were not only facilitating Taliban operations, but were actively selling American military intelligence to insurgent commanders. The evidence she gathered implicated 3 American defense contractors who were using their positions to manipulate military procurement contracts and intelligence sharing agreements for personal profit. The corruption network Elena uncovered extended from Afghan poppy fields to Pentagon procurement offices, involving American military officers, defense contractors, and civilian officials who were trading soldiers' lives for Swiss bank account deposits. The evidence she compiled was comprehensive enough to trigger investigations that would have reached the highest levels of the Defense Department and resulted in congressional hearings that could have destabilized American military operations. Throughout the region, Elena transmitted her findings to her commanding officers through encrypted channels, expecting the evidence to trigger arrests and prosecutions that would clean up a corruption network that was directly responsible for American combat deaths. Instead, she received orders to cease her investigation and prepare for immediate extraction from Afghanistan. When Elena questioned the orders, she was told that her intelligence had been reviewed by senior officials who determined that the corruption allegations were based on insufficient evidence and could compromise ongoing operations if pursued further. Elena realized that the corruption network she'd discovered included people with enough power to silence investigations and eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Her unit had stumbled onto something that threatened individuals who could rewrite official reports, classify evidence above congressional oversight levels, and make problems disappear using resources that operated outside normal military command structures. That's when Elena Rodriguez learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones wearing the same uniform. And sometimes serving your country means discovering that your country's leadership has been compromised by people who consider patriotism a commodity to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. The order to abort her investigation came through official channels, encrypted with proper authentication codes and bearing the signature of Colonel Michael Brennan, Elena's direct superior in the Shadow Wolf command structure. But Elena had worked with Brennan for 3 years, had memorized his communication patterns and decision-making protocols, and something about the message felt wrong in ways that triggered every instinct she developed during 5 years of operations where paranoia was a survival skill. Brennan never used passive voice in operational directives. He never referenced senior officials without providing specific authorization codes. Most importantly, he never ordered mission termination without face-to-face briefings that included detailed explanations of political considerations that required operational adjustments. Elena was stationed at a forward operating base disguised as a medical clinic in the Nangarhar province, 30 miles from the Pakistani border. Her team of 4 other Shadow Wolf operatives had spent 14 months building their cover identities and gathering evidence that implicated corruption networks extending from Afghan government offices to Pentagon procurement divisions. The evidence they'd compiled filled 37 encrypted files documenting financial transfers, communication intercepts, and photographic proof of meetings between American defense contractors and Taliban commanders. Elena possessed recorded conversations in which Afghan Ministry of Defense officials discussed selling American military intelligence in exchange for deposits in Dubai bank accounts. She had photographs of American contractors delivering weapons to insurgent groups while billing the Pentagon for security services that were never provided. Most damaging was her documentation of a systematic assassination program targeting Afghan civilians who'd provided intelligence to American forces. The program was being run by American contractors who were eliminating their own intelligence assets to protect Taliban operations that were generating profits for the corruption network. Elena's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that was directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers and thousands of Afghan civilians, all to protect a criminal enterprise that was generating millions of dollars in illegal profits for people who'd sworn oaths to defend American interests. When Elena received the abort order, she immediately attempted to contact Colonel Brennan through secure satellite communication channels. After 4 hours of trying different frequencies and authentication protocols, she received a response that chilled her to the bone. Shadow Wolf 7, this is command. Colonel Brennan is currently unavailable. Your new operational controller is Deputy Director Marcus Kellerman, Civilian Oversight, Defense Intelligence Agency. Acknowledge receipt and prepare for immediate extraction. Elena had never heard of Marcus Kellerman, which was unusual since Shadow Wolf operatives were briefed on all personnel in their command structure. She ran Kellerman's name through military databases using her secure terminal and discovered that his personnel file was classified above her security clearance level, which shouldn't have been possible since Shadow Wolf operatives held some of the highest clearances in the intelligence community. Elena made a decision that would save her life and doom her teammates. Instead of acknowledging the extraction order, she activated emergency protocols that dispersed her team to predetermined safe locations while she attempted to verify whether their command structure had been compromised. Shadow Wolf operatives Sarah Chun and Maria Vasquez were extracted to a safe house in Kabul, while Elena sent Rachel Morrison and Jessica Walsh to a secondary location near Jalalabad. Elena remained at the medical clinic to monitor communications and determine whether their investigation had triggered hostile responses from the corruption network they'd been documenting. At 2:47 a.m. local time, Elena intercepted communications between American military units that shouldn't have known about Shadow Wolf operations. The communications used proper military authentication codes, but referenced tactical objectives that Elena recognized as elimination missions rather than extraction operations. Elena realized that the corruption network had identified Shadow Wolf as a threat and was using official military resources to eliminate her team under the cover of routine counterterrorism operations. The people she'd been investigating possessed enough influence within the military command structure to authorize kill missions against American Special Operations personnel. Elena attempted to warn her teammates, but discovered that their secure communication networks had been compromised. When she tried to contact the safe house in Kabul, she received confirmation that Sarah Chun and Maria Vasquez had been killed during what military reports would describe as a Taliban attack on a suspected terrorist facility. Elena's attempt to reach Rachel Morrison and Jessica Walsh at the Jalalabad location resulted in similar confirmation that both operatives had been eliminated during what would be reported as a successful counter-terrorism operation that had eliminated foreign intelligence assets operating in Afghan territory. Elena Rodriguez was now the only surviving member of Shadow Wolf, trapped in hostile territory with evidence of a corruption conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American military and intelligence leadership. The same people who'd ordered her teammates killed were using official resources to hunt her while maintaining plausible deniability about Shadow Wolf's existence. Elena abandoned the medical clinic and went underground using survival skills that had been drilled into every Shadow Wolf operative during their training in Montana. She had emergency funds, false documentation, and communication equipment that would allow her to survive indefinitely in hostile territory while planning her next moves. Over the following weeks, Elena monitored military communications and intelligence traffic to understand how her unit's elimination was being explained through official channels. She discovered that Shadow Wolf was being portrayed as a foreign intelligence operation that had been successfully disrupted by American forces. According to official reports, the women killed in Kabul and Jalalabad had been Russian operatives attempting to gather intelligence on American military operations in Afghanistan. Their deaths were being celebrated as successful counterintelligence operations that had prevented foreign espionage activities. Elena realized that the corruption network possessed not only the power to eliminate inconvenient investigators but also the ability to rewrite official records to justify their actions. Shadow Wolf's 5 years of successful operations and service to American interests were being erased and replaced with fabricated reports that portrayed them as foreign agents who'd threatened national security. Colonel Michael Brennan, Elena's commanding officer, died in a helicopter crash 3 days after Elena went underground. Military investigators attributed the crash to mechanical failure, but Elena understood that Brennan had been eliminated because he'd known too much about Shadow Wolf operations and could have contradicted the false reports about their unit's true identity. Elena spent 6 months in Afghanistan gathering additional evidence while avoiding American military patrols that were searching for her under orders that portrayed her as a foreign intelligence operative who needed to be eliminated or captured. She documented the systematic assassination of everyone who'd been involved in Shadow Wolf operations, from support personnel to intelligence analysts who'd processed their mission reports. The elimination program was being coordinated by Marcus Kellerman, who Elena discovered was not a defense intelligence agency official but rather a private contractor who specialized in managing sensitive security situations for defense industry clients. Kellerman had been hired by the corruption network to eliminate the Shadow Wolf threat using official military resources and fabricated intelligence reports. Elena's investigation revealed that the corruption network extended beyond defense contractors and Afghan officials to include congressional staff members, Pentagon procurement officers, and senior military commanders who'd been compromised through bribery, blackmail, or ideology. The network possessed enough political influence to classify investigations above congressional oversight levels and enough operational resources to eliminate witnesses, using methods that appeared to be legitimate counterterrorism activities. Elena realized that exposing the conspiracy would require her to survive long enough to gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed or classified by the same people she was investigating. She also understood that returning to the United States would mean certain death unless she could accumulate enough evidence to protect herself through public disclosure or legal proceedings. Elena Rodriguez began planning her own death, understanding that Captain Elena Rodriguez would have to die in Afghanistan in order for the woman who would eventually become Maria Santos to survive long enough to seek justice for her murdered teammates and the American soldiers who'd been betrayed by their own leadership. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The official report would state that the last Shadow Wolf operative had been killed during a raid on a suspected terrorist compound near the Pakistani border, her body destroyed in an explosion that left no recoverable remains. Elena made sure the explosion was real enough to convince investigators while providing her with the cover she needed to disappear from official records and begin the long process of building a new identity that would allow her to hunt the people who'd destroyed everything she'd sworn to protect. Elena's death was meticulously choreographed, using demolition skills she'd learned during Shadow Wolf training and psychological warfare techniques that made the deception believable to both American military investigators and the corruption network that had ordered her elimination. She spent 3 weeks preparing an abandoned compound near the Pakistani border, planting evidence that would suggest a foreign intelligence operative had been using the location as a safe house. Elena scattered Russian-manufactured weapons, communication equipment with Cyrillic markings, and forged documents that supported the official narrative about Shadow Wolf being a hostile foreign operation. The compound's destruction was timed to coincide with an American military patrol that had been manipulated into investigating the location through intelligence Elena had carefully leaked through compromised channels. When the explosion occurred, military investigators found exactly what they expected to find: evidence of a foreign operative who'd been eliminated while attempting to escape American forces. Elena watched the investigation from a hillside 2 miles away, using binoculars to observe American soldiers collecting evidence that would confirm her official death. The investigators recovered fragments of personal items she'd planted in the compound, including pieces of equipment that matched gear issued to the fictional Russian operatives described in fabricated intelligence reports. The explosion left no identifiable human remains, which military investigators attributed to the intensity of the blast and Elena's presumed use of high explosive materials to destroy sensitive intelligence before her position was overrun. Elena had actually used her knowledge of forensic investigation procedures to ensure that no biological evidence would survive to contradict the official story. Elena Rodriguez was declared killed in action during a successful counterterrorism operation that had eliminated the last known member of a foreign intelligence cell. Military officials credited her death with closing a significant security breach that had threatened American operations throughout the region. Elena spent the following 18 months moving through Pakistani and Iranian territory using smuggling networks that operated independently of official intelligence services. She'd established connections with these networks during previous Shadow Wolf operations, cultivating relationships with tribal leaders and criminal organizations that could provide assistance without government oversight or intelligence agency involvement. Her journey from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to the United States required crossing 7 international boundaries, using false documentation that she'd prepared during her months underground. Elena possessed multiple backup identities with complete background documentation, financial resources, and cover stories that had been tested during Shadow Wolf training exercises. The Maria Santos identity had been Elena's primary backup cover since her deployment to Afghanistan. She'd spent months developing the character's background, creating employment history, establishing banking relationships, and building a paper trail that would withstand routine background investigations without triggering deeper scrutiny from intelligence agencies. Maria Santos was a Mexican immigrant who'd entered the United States 15 years earlier and worked various service industry jobs while building a quiet, unremarkable life. Elena had chosen this specific background because it provided natural explanations for maintaining distance from others, avoiding attention from authorities, and working in positions that offered access to intelligence opportunities without raising suspicions about her qualifications or interests. Elena's selection of the Grand Harbor Resort as her base of operations was based on 3 years of research into facilities that hosted high-level government officials, defense contractors, and intelligence community personnel. The resort's location 50 miles from Washington, D.C., made it an ideal venue for unofficial meetings between people who needed to conduct sensitive business away from government buildings and congressional oversight. Elena had identified 17 regular guests who were directly involved in defense procurement, intelligence operations, or congressional oversight of military activities. These individuals used the resort for personal vacations, business meetings, and recreational activities that provided opportunities for Elena to conduct surveillance and gather intelligence about their activities, associations, and potential vulnerabilities. Working as Maria Santos allowed Elena to access areas of the resort that were restricted to guests, including business centers, conference rooms, and private suites where sensitive conversations took place. Her position with the night cleaning crew provided perfect cover for surveillance operations, since housekeeping staff were expected to be invisible and were rarely questioned about their presence in restricted areas. Elena had spent 8 years building comprehensive intelligence profiles on corruption network members who frequented the resort. She documented their travel patterns, business relationships, personal habits, and security vulnerabilities. She'd identified potential leverage points, including extramarital affairs, financial irregularities, and substance abuse problems that could be exploited for blackmail or behavioral manipulation purposes. Elena's most valuable intelligence breakthrough came during her 4th year at the resort, when she discovered that Marcus Kellerman was using a suite on the 18th floor for quarterly meetings with defense contractors and congressional staff members. Elena had managed to install surveillance equipment in the suite's ventilation system, providing her with audio recordings of conversations that documented ongoing corruption activities and revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed her unit. The recordings revealed that the Shadow Wolf elimination had been just one operation in a broader program designed to protect defense industry profits by eliminating investigators who threatened lucrative government contracts. Elena learned that similar elimination operations had targeted military auditors, congressional investigators, and journalists who'd gotten too close to uncovering systematic fraud within defense procurement programs. Elena also discovered that several of her former Shadow Wolf teammates had been conducting their own investigations into different aspects of the same corruption network. Sarah Chun had been investigating cybersecurity contracts that were being used to provide foreign governments with access to American military communication systems. Rachel Morrison had uncovered evidence that American aircraft manufacturers were deliberately installing defective components in military aircraft to generate maintenance contracts that generated billions in additional revenue. The recordings confirmed that Elena's teammates had been murdered not just to protect the Afghan corruption network she'd been investigating, but to prevent exposure of a comprehensive criminal enterprise that had been operating within the defense industry for more than a decade. Elena's surveillance operation had also revealed that the corruption network was aware that Shadow Wolf elimination might have been incomplete. Kellerman's conversations included references to ongoing searches for potential survivors and contingency plans for dealing with witnesses who might surface in the future. Elena realized that her survival was known, or at least suspected, by the people who'd orchestrated her unit's elimination. Her decision to remain underground rather than seek justice through official channels had been correct, because the corruption network possessed enough influence to suppress investigations and eliminate witnesses who attempted to expose their activities. Elena's 8 years as Maria Santos had been a strategic waiting game, gathering intelligence while building leverage that could eventually be used to seek justice for her murdered teammates and the soldiers who'd been killed to protect criminal profits. She documented evidence that could destroy the careers and freedom of dozens of high-level officials, but she'd also learned that exposing the conspiracy would require perfect timing and overwhelming evidence that couldn't be suppressed or discredited. Elena's internal struggle during her years in exile was Between her desire for immediate justice and her understanding that premature action would result in her elimination without achieving accountability for the people responsible for her teammates' deaths, she'd maintained discipline through meditation techniques learned during Shadow Wolf training, focusing on long-term strategic objectives rather than emotional satisfaction. Elena had prepared multiple contingency plans for different scenarios that might force her to abandon her surveillance operation. She'd established escape routes, backup identities, and financial resources that would allow her to disappear again if her cover was compromised. She'd also prepared evidence packages that would be automatically released to journalists and congressional investigators if she was killed or disappeared. Elena's discovery by Patricia Coleman represented both a threat to her operational security and a potential opportunity to finally seek justice for Shadow Wolf. After 8 years of patient intelligence gathering, Elena possessed enough evidence to destroy the corruption network, but she needed allies who could help her navigate the political and legal challenges involved in exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Elena Rodriguez had spent 8 years learning to be Maria Santos, but she'd never stopped being a Shadow Wolf operative, preparing for the moment when she could emerge from hiding and finish the mission that had cost her teammates their lives. Elena Rodriguez had 36 hours before Marcus Kellerman's response team would arrive at the Grand Harbor Resort to eliminate the Shadow Wolf survivor who'd been discovered during a routine medical examination. She'd intercepted encrypted communications between Kellerman and a private military contractor specializing in wet work operations, discussing deployment timelines and asset elimination protocols that Elena recognized from her own days conducting similar missions. But Elena's biggest concern wasn't Kellerman's assassination team. Her surveillance equipment had detected unusual activity in the resort's executive suites, where 3 separate meetings were scheduled to take place over the next 2 days, involving defense contractors, Congressional Oversight Committee members, and senior Pentagon officials. The convergence of these high-value targets suggested something significant was being planned, something that required face-to-face coordination between people who normally communicated through intermediaries. Elena's 8 years of intelligence gathering had taught her to recognize patterns that indicated major operational planning. The specific combination of attendees, the timing of their arrival, and the security precautions being implemented around their meetings suggested that the corruption network was preparing to execute something that would require congressional approval, Pentagon resources, and defense industry cooperation. Elena accessed the resort's reservation system through maintenance terminals she'd been using for surveillance purposes and discovered that the meetings were centered around a classified defense appropriations bill that would authorize $847 million in emergency funding for counterterrorism operations in Southeast Asia. The bill was scheduled for congressional committee approval in 72 hours, which meant the resort meetings were final coordination sessions before the vote. Elena's analysis of intercepted communications and financial records indicated that the emergency funding was a fabrication designed to generate defense contracts that would be awarded to companies controlled by the corruption network. The supposed counterterrorism operations would never be conducted, but the appropriated funds would be diverted through shell companies and offshore accounts while military officials filed false reports claiming mission success. Elena realized she was witnessing the same type of fraud operation that had been conducted in Afghanistan, scaled up to generate nearly $1 billion in stolen government funds. The corruption network had learned from their Afghanistan experience and was now conducting fraud operations that were too large and complex for traditional oversight mechanisms to detect or investigate. Elena's decision to break her cover wasn't motivated by self-preservation or revenge against the people who destroyed her unit. She chose to emerge from 8 years of hiding because she was the only person positioned to prevent a $1 billion theft. that would directly contribute to future military casualties when soldiers were deployed on missions without the equipment, and support that taxpayers believed they were funding. Elena began her operation at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday, maintaining her normal arrival schedule to avoid triggering security alerts from personnel who monitored employee access patterns. Instead of proceeding to her assigned cleaning areas, Elena used service corridors and maintenance passages she'd mapped during 8 years of surveillance to access the resort's executive conference facilities on the 18th floor. Elena's first objective was establishing real-time intelligence about the meetings taking place over the next 48 hours. She accessed the resort's internal communication systems through maintenance terminals and planted additional surveillance devices in conference rooms, private suites, and communication centers that would provide comprehensive coverage of all corruption network activities. Elena's second objective was identifying specific individuals who could be leveraged to prevent the congressional vote that would authorize the fraudulent appropriations. She'd spent years developing psychological profiles of corruption network members, cataloging their personal vulnerabilities, financial irregularities, and behavioral patterns that could be exploited for operational purposes. Congressman Richard Volkov, chairman of the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, was scheduled to arrive Wednesday morning for meetings that would coordinate his committee's approval of the emergency funding bill. Elena's surveillance had revealed that Volkov was being blackmailed by the corruption network over gambling debts in an extramarital affair that would destroy his political career if exposed publicly. Senator Catherine Mills, ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, would arrive Wednesday afternoon to discuss oversight protocols that would prevent congressional investigation of the emergency funding operations. Elena's intelligence indicated that Mills was being manipulated through her son's drug addiction and the corruption network's connections to treatment facilities that were providing him with medical care in exchange for his mother's cooperation. Secretary Thomas Crawford was scheduled for Thursday morning meetings to coordinate Pentagon approval of operational plans that would justify the emergency appropriations. Elena's research had identified Crawford as an unwilling participant in the conspiracy, coerced through threats against his family, and fabricated evidence of financial improprieties that could result in criminal prosecution if he refused cooperation. Elena understood that preventing the billion-dollar fraud would require surgical precision in neutralizing the leverage being used against each official while providing them with evidence that would justify their refusal to participate in the conspiracy. She would have to conduct 3 separate psychological warfare operations simultaneously while avoiding detection by Kellerman's assassination team. Elena's plan required her to become Captain Elena Rodriguez again, using skills she'd maintained through years of practice but hadn't applied operationally since her unit's destruction. She would have to conduct infiltration, manipulation, and elimination operations using equipment and resources available through her position as a hotel housekeeper. Elena began with Congressman Volkov, who'd arrived early and was staying in Suite 1847 while conducting preliminary meetings with defense contractors. Elena accessed his suite during the scheduled meeting and planted evidence that would reveal the true scope of the corruption network's blackmail operations against congressional officials. Elena's psychological profile indicated that Volkov was fundamentally patriotic but had been compromised through personal weaknesses that the corruption network had systematically exploited. She left documentation showing that his gambling debts had been artificially created through rigged poker games, and that his extramarital affair had been orchestrated using a woman who was actually a foreign intelligence asset working for the corruption network. Elena's evidence package also included financial records showing that Volkov's cooperation had been purchased through threats and manipulation rather than genuine criminal activity on his part. The documentation provided him with legal protection and political justification for refusing to support the emergency appropriations bill. Elena's operation against Senator Mills required more sophisticated psychological manipulation because Mills was genuinely trying to protect her son while serving what she believed were legitimate national security interests. Elena accessed Mills' private communications and discovered that her son's drug addiction was being deliberately maintained by treatment facilities controlled by the corruption network. Elena arranged for Mills to discover evidence that her son's medical treatment was being sabotaged to ensure his continued addiction and dependence on corruption network resources. Elena provided Mills with contact information for legitimate treatment facilities and evidence that would allow federal prosecutors to investigate the medical fraud being perpetrated against her family. Elena's most challenging operation involved Defense Secretary Crawford, who possessed enough military experience to recognize psychological warfare techniques, but was being coerced through threats against his family that Elena couldn't simply neutralize through evidence disclosure. Elena needed to provide Crawford with protection against the corruption network while giving him operational support that would allow him to resist their coercion. Elena used her Shadow Wolf training to conduct a comprehensive security assessment of threats against Crawford's family, identifying specific individuals who were conducting surveillance and intimidation operations. Elena eliminated 3 of these threats through methods that appeared to be accidents or unrelated criminal activity, while providing Crawford with evidence that federal law enforcement agencies were investigating the corruption network. Elena's operations took 31 hours to complete, during which she functioned as both Maria Santos, the housekeeper, and Captain Elena Rodriguez, the psychological warfare specialist. She maintained her cover identity while conducting the most complex special operations mission of her career, using custodial access and housekeeping equipment to accomplish objectives that would have challenged entire intelligence agency task forces. By Thursday morning, Elena had provided 3 high-ranking government officials with evidence, protection, and justification for refusing to participate in a billion-dollar fraud operation that would have funded corruption network activities for the next decade. The emergency appropriations bill was withdrawn from congressional consideration when Congressman Volkov announced that his committee had discovered irregularities in the proposed funding that required comprehensive investigation before any vote could be scheduled. Elena Rodriguez had successfully prevented the largest defense fraud operation in American history, while maintaining her cover as a hotel housekeeper who cleaned toilets and changed bedsheets for people who still had no idea that a ghost had just saved them from their own corruption. The collapse of the emergency appropriations fraud began at 6:23 a.m. Thursday morning when Congressman Richard Volkov called an emergency session of the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee to present evidence that would fundamentally reshape congressional oversight of defense spending. The documents Elena had provided him revealed a pattern of systematic fraud extending back 12 years, involving dozens of officials and generating billions in stolen taxpayer funds. Volkov's presentation to his colleagues included audio recordings of Marcus Kellerman discussing assassination operations against military auditors, financial records documenting payments to congressional staff members in exchange for their cooperation in suppressing investigations, and correspondence between defense contractors outlining strategies for eliminating witnesses who threatened their criminal operations. Senator Catherine Mills simultaneously convened an emergency session of the Senate Intelligence Committee, presenting evidence that foreign intelligence services had been deliberately allowed to compromise American military communication systems through cybersecurity contracts that were designed to provide enemy access while generating profits for corruption network members. Mills' evidence included documentation showing that her son's drug addiction had been artificially maintained through medical facilities controlled by the corruption network, and that similar leverage operations had been conducted against the family members of dozens of government officials to ensure their compliance with criminal activities. Defense Secretary Thomas Crawford initiated a comprehensive internal investigation within the Pentagon, focusing on procurement fraud, falsified operational reports, and the systematic elimination of military personnel who had discovered evidence of corruption within defense contracting operations. Crawford's investigation was supported by evidence Elena had provided showing that threats against his family had been coordinated through private military contractors working for the corruption network. By noon Thursday, federal law enforcement agencies were executing simultaneous arrest warrants against 47 individuals involved in the corruption network, including active-duty military officers, congressional staff members, defense contractors, and private security personnel who had conducted assassination operations against government auditors and military investigators. Marcus Kellerman was arrested at the Grand Harbor Resort while conducting what he believed would be final coordination meetings before Elena's elimination. FBI agents found him in possession of assassination contracts, encrypted communication, devices linking him to foreign intelligence services, and financial records documenting his personal profits from 12 years of defense fraud operations. Elena watched Kellerman's arrest from a service corridor, using surveillance equipment she'd installed to monitor the FBI operation that was finally bringing justice to the man responsible for destroying her unit. Kellerman's expression as federal agents placed him in handcuffs was identical to his demeanor 15 years earlier when he'd explained to Elena why Shadow Wolf had to be eliminated to protect national security interests. The FBI investigation, led by Agent Sarah Morrison, quickly expanded to include international components as financial records revealed that corruption network members had been selling American military intelligence to hostile foreign governments, while using their official positions to eliminate investigators who threatened their operations. Morrison had been specifically chosen to lead the investigation because her sister Rachel Morrison had been one of the Shadow Wolf operatives murdered in Afghanistan, and the FBI needed someone with personal motivation to pursue justice despite political pressure to limit the investigation's scope. Agent Morrison's team recovered Elena's complete intelligence archive, including 8 years of surveillance recordings, financial analysis, and operational documentation that provided prosecutors with comprehensive evidence of the largest defense corruption conspiracy in American history. Elena had been preparing for this moment since her first day working as Maria Santos, building a case that would be impossible to suppress or dismiss through political influence. Elena's decision to reveal herself to federal investigators came on Friday morning when Agent Morrison requested an interview with the resort housekeeper who had provided the intelligence that triggered the nationwide arrests. Elena met Morrison in the same conference room where she'd once cleaned tables while listening to conversations about billion-dollar fraud operations. "Miss Santos," Agent Morrison said, though her tone suggested she understood that name was not her interview subject's real identity. "We need to discuss your knowledge of the corruption network and how you acquired the evidence that made these arrests possible." Elena removed the faded name tag she'd worn for 8 years and placed it on the conference table between them. "My name is Captain Elena Rodriguez, and I was the commanding officer of Shadow Wolf, a special operations unit that was eliminated 15 years ago because we discovered the same corruption network you're investigating now." Agent Morrison had spent her entire career investigating complex criminal conspiracies, but Elena's revelation required her to reconceptualize everything she thought she understood about the case. The housekeeper who'd provided the evidence wasn't a civilian whistleblower or an intelligence asset. She was a supposedly dead special operations officer who'd spent 15 years gathering evidence to seek justice for her murdered teammates. Elena's debriefing took 18 hours over 3 days, during which she provided comprehensive testimony about Shadow Wolf operations, the circumstances surrounding her unit's elimination, and the intelligence-gathering activities she'd conducted while working under deep cover at the resort. Her testimony was corroborated by classified military records that had been sealed since the Afghanistan operation, and by physical evidence that confirmed her identity through biometric analysis and psychological evaluation protocols. The revelation that a Shadow Wolf operative had survived the unit's elimination triggered a comprehensive review of military records and intelligence reports from the Afghanistan operation. Military investigators discovered that official reports about Shadow Wolf being a foreign intelligence operation had been fabricated by the same corruption network that was now facing federal prosecution. Colonel Michael Brennan, Elena's commanding officer who had died in a helicopter crash, was posthumously vindicated when military investigators determined that his death had been an assassination rather than mechanical failure. Brennan's family was informed that he had died attempting to protect American Special Operations personnel from assassination by domestic criminals who had compromised military command structures. Elena's Shadow Wolf teammates were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their service in operations that had prevented terrorist attacks and protected American lives throughout their 5 years of classified missions. Their families were finally informed of their true service records and the circumstances surrounding their deaths, ending 15 years of believing their daughters had died during routine military operations in Afghanistan. Elena herself was offered reinstatement to active duty with promotion to colonel and assignment to a senior position within military intelligence operations. She declined the offer, explaining that her skills were better utilized in civilian law enforcement roles where she could continue investigating corruption within defense and intelligence communities. Elena accepted a position as a special consultant with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, where her expertise in psychological warfare and deep cover operations would be applied to investigating criminal networks that had compromised government officials. Her first assignment was leading a task force investigating defense contracting fraud, focusing specifically on companies that had used assassination and intimidation tactics against government auditors. Patricia Coleman, the nurse who'd recognized Elena's tattoo and initiated the investigation that brought down the corruption network, was placed in federal witness protection due to threats from surviving network members. Elena personally oversaw Patricia's security arrangements, ensuring that the civilian who had inadvertently triggered justice for Shadow Wolf would be protected from retaliation. Elena's transformation from Maria Santos back to Elena Rodriguez required extensive psychological evaluation and identity restoration procedures, but she maintained her appreciation for the 8 years she'd spent as an invisible hotel housekeeper. Those years had taught her that the most important work often goes unrecognized, and that true service sometimes requires sacrificing credit and recognition for the greater good of completing necessary missions. The corruption network's elimination resulted in $4.2 billion in recovered funds that were returned to defense appropriations for legitimate military operations. Elena's evidence led to congressional reforms of defense contracting oversight and the establishment of independent audit procedures designed to prevent future systematic fraud within military procurement operations. Elena Rodriguez had spent 15 years seeking justice for her murdered teammates, while preventing billions in defense fraud and eliminating a criminal network that had compromised American national security interests. The ghost had finally come home, and the people responsible for Shadow Wolf's destruction were facing the consequences of underestimating what a dead woman could accomplish when she refused to stay buried. Elena Rodriguez returned to the Grand Harbor Resort exactly 1 year after. Her identity had been revealed not as Maria Santos, the housekeeper, but as Special Agent Elena Rodriguez, FBI Public Corruption Unit. She walked through the same marble lobby she'd cleaned for 8 years, past the executive suites where she'd conducted surveillance operations, and into the conference room where federal prosecutors had presented evidence that resulted in 47 convictions and the recovery of $4.2 billion in stolen government funds. The purpose of her visit was to meet with a group of young FBI agents, military intelligence officers, and congressional investigators who were being trained in advanced corruption investigation techniques. Elena's curriculum focused on long-term undercover operations, psychological warfare applications in domestic law enforcement, and the patient intelligence gathering methods that had enabled her to dismantle the largest defense fraud conspiracy. In American History. Agent Patricia Chun, granddaughter of Elena's former Shadow Wolf teammate Sarah Chun, was among the trainees. Patricia had joined the FBI specifically to continue the work her grandmother had died pursuing, and Elena had personally mentored her through the psychological challenges of investigating crimes that had cost family members their lives. Patricia possessed the same analytical brilliance that had made her grandmother invaluable to Shadow Wolf, combined with a determination to ensure that systemic corruption would never again be allowed to operate with impunity within government institutions. Elena's teaching methods emphasized the importance of invisible service, explaining to her students that the most critical intelligence operations were conducted by people who never received recognition or public acknowledgement. She used her own experience as Maria Santos to demonstrate how assumed identities could provide access to information that traditional investigation techniques couldn't obtain. The custodial staff, maintenance workers, and service personnel are invisible to the people they serve, Elena explained to her trainees during a practical exercise. That invisibility is one of the most powerful intelligence-gathering advantages available to investigators willing to sacrifice ego and recognition for operational effectiveness. Elena's training program had become the standard curriculum for federal agents investigating corruption within military and intelligence communities. Her techniques had been adopted by agencies investigating fraud operations in multiple government departments, resulting in prosecutions that had recovered over $12 billion in stolen taxpayer funds during the 3 years since the Shadow Wolf case. Elena maintained relationships with her former colleagues from the resort, ensuring that the housekeeping staff, who had worked alongside Maria Santos, understood that their service was valued and important. She established scholarship programs for the children of service industry workers, funding education opportunities that would allow them to pursue careers in law enforcement, military service, or public administration. Janet Morrison, Elena's former night shift supervisor, had become a close friend and confidential informant who helped Elena identify other facilities where high-level government officials might be conducting sensitive business that required surveillance. Janet's understanding of hospitality industry operations and her ability to identify unusual behavior patterns among guests had made her an invaluable asset in ongoing corruption investigations. Carmen Valdez, one of the housekeepers who had worked with Maria Santos, had used Elena's scholarship program to complete nursing school and was now working as a medical examiner's assistant, applying forensic science skills to investigate suspicious deaths that might be connected to government corruption cases. Carmen's bilingual capabilities and cultural background had enabled her to identify international connections in corruption networks that other investigators had missed. Elena's influence extended beyond her immediate colleagues to the broader community of people who had encountered her during her 8 years in hiding. She maintained correspondence with resort guests who had unknowingly been subjects of her surveillance operations, some of whom had become allies in ongoing anti-corruption efforts after learning about the criminal activities that had been conducted around them without their knowledge. Defense Secretary Thomas Crawford, who had been coerced into participating in the corruption conspiracy through threats against his family, had implemented comprehensive reforms within Pentagon procurement procedures based on Elena's recommendations. Crawford's reforms included independent audit protocols, whistleblower protection programs, and psychological evaluation requirements for personnel with access to sensitive contracting information. Elena's story had become required reading at military academies, intelligence training facilities, and law enforcement institutions throughout the country. Her experience demonstrated that individual determination and patient intelligence gathering could overcome institutional corruption that seemed too powerful and well connected to be challenged through conventional investigative methods. Young military officers studying Elena's case learned that sometimes serving your country requires challenging the people who claim to represent national interests while actually pursuing personal profit at the expense of soldier safety and taxpayer resources. Elena's willingness to sacrifice her career, identity, and personal relationships to seek justice for her murdered teammates provided a model for principled resistance against corruption within military command structures. Intelligence community personnel used Elena's psychological warfare techniques to conduct investigations into foreign influence operations and domestic terrorism networks. Her methods for developing long-term cover identities and conducting surveillance in civilian environments had been adapted for operations targeting threats that required years of patient observation and evidence gathering. Elena's mentorship extended to civilian law enforcement agencies investigating organized crime, political corruption, and corporate fraud. Her expertise in reading human behavior, identifying psychological vulnerabilities, and conducting operations without leaving evidence had applications in criminal investigations that extended far beyond military and intelligence contexts. Elena established the Shadow Wolf Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided support for families of military personnel who had been killed or injured due to equipment failures, intelligence compromises, or operational security breaches caused by defense contractor fraud. The foundation's resources helped families navigate military bureaucracy, access legal representation, and obtain compensation for losses caused by systemic corruption within defense procurement operations. The foundation also sponsored research into military contractor oversight, publishing reports that documented continuing fraud operations and recommending policy reforms to prevent future systematic theft of defense appropriations. Elena's foundation had become a respected voice in congressional debates about military spending and contractor accountability. Elena's personal relationships had been profoundly affected by her 15-year journey from Shadow Wolf commander to hotel housekeeper to federal agent. She had never married, never had children, and maintained emotional distance from people who might become leverage points for enemies seeking to compromise her operations. But she had found fulfillment in mentoring young investigators and supporting families who had been affected by the same criminal networks that had destroyed her unit. Elena's apartment displayed photographs of her Shadow Wolf teammates alongside commendations from FBI operations and letters from students who had applied her techniques in their own investigations. She kept the faded name tag from her years as Maria Santos as a reminder that sometimes the most important work required sacrificing recognition and accepting invisibility as the price of serving purposes larger than personal ambition. Elena Rodriguez had learned that justice sometimes requires patience, that truth sometimes emerges slowly, and that the most dangerous enemies are often the people who use patriotic rhetoric to justify criminal behavior. Her story demonstrated that individual integrity could overcome institutional corruption when combined with professional competence, strategic thinking, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for principles that matter more than safety or recognition. The woman who had cleaned hotel rooms while gathering evidence against $1 billion fraud conspiracy had become living proof that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones everyone ignores, and that sometimes the most important victories are achieved by people whose names will never appear in history books but whose actions change the course of events in ways that protect countless lives and preserve institutions that serve the public good rather than private profit. Elena Rodriguez continued serving her country, but now she did so with full recognition of her contributions and the knowledge that her teammates' deaths had finally been avenged through justice rather than revenge. And through this systematic dismantling of criminal networks, rather than individual acts of retribution that would have dishonored everything, Shadow Wolf had represented during their years of invisible service to national security interests that extended far beyond personal satisfaction or emotional closure. 6 months later, Elena received a call that would have seemed impossible during her years as Maria Santos. The President of the United States was requesting a private meeting to discuss establishing a new oversight division within the Department of Justice, specifically designed to investigate corruption that crossed traditional agency boundaries. Elena met the President in the Oval Office, wearing the same professional demeanor she'd once hidden behind a housekeeper's uniform. During their conversation, the President mentioned that Elena's case had fundamentally changed how the administration viewed the importance of invisible government workers, who had access to sensitive information through their seemingly ordinary jobs. "Agent Rodriguez," the President said, "your story has taught us that sometimes the most valuable intelligence assets are the people everyone assumes are powerless. We're implementing new protocols to ensure that service workers, maintenance staff, and support personnel have secure channels for reporting suspicious activities without fear of retaliation." Elena's response reflected the wisdom she'd gained through 15 years of operating in shadows. "Mr. President, the most dangerous assumption we can make is that threats to national security always come from foreign enemies. Sometimes the greatest dangers come from people who've forgotten that public service means serving the public rather than personal interests." Elena's final assignment took her back to Afghanistan, not as a Shadow Wolf operative, but as a senior investigator documenting how corruption networks had affected military operations and civilian casualties. She visited the mountain caves where her teammates had died, finally able to honor their sacrifice openly rather than in secret. Standing in those caves, Elena realized that sometimes justice takes decades to achieve, but it's worth the wait when it prevents future betrayals and protects the people who serve their country with honor rather than greed. Sometimes, the person emptying your trash can use to lead special operations that save thousands of lives. Sometimes the quiet worker you never notice is actually the most dangerous person in the building. And sometimes, being invisible is the most powerful position of all. Have you ever wondered about the hidden stories of the people around you? What extraordinary past might be concealed behind an ordinary present? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about hidden heroes who changed the world while staying completely invisible. Your next inspiration is just one click away.